Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. It's not quite time yet, and I think we're waiting for a couple more attendees. So we're just going to give everybody a couple of minutes to join us. I'll make sure that they've got sound and screen working. So I'm going to put myself on pause for a couple of minutes just to give everybody the chance to log in. Okay, good morning, everybody. I think we've got 14 attendees. I think that should be everybody. But we're going to start anyway because we've got a lot to get through today. I don't want to scare you, but we do have a lot to get through. My name is Rachel Roberts, and I work with the associate management team, specifically around the EPA side at the moment, and this new program of work to roll out EPA Pro. So in the room with me, I've got Jane Cowley. You probably know Jane. I'm sure you all work with Jane. And we've also got Tracy and Lorraine online as well. I think we'll be joined by Rebecca later on, possibly today, from the associate management team. And we've got a range of people, yourselves, from the Business Admin Standard. So welcome to you all. Now, you're all currently on mute, and that's really just so we can manage the sound. But that's not a problem. I'm going to give you plenty of opportunity to ask questions. And I think it's important that you ask questions throughout. So please, if you do want to ask a question and you don't want to wait until the natural pause when I ask you, you can just raise your hand. There is the webinar facility to do that. You can raise your hand and then I can bring you in. And what I'll do is I'll take you off mute so you can then address everybody. You can ask your question and then I can respond to you, so we can do it that way. If you prefer to ask questions privately, you've also got the question function on GoToWebinar too. So we'll also monitor that, and as I spot the questions coming in, I'll answer those at the appropriate time. Okay, so hopefully you should be able to see my screen. If you're struggling with any sound problems, or if you can't see my screen, can you just raise your hand? Let's just get a sense of how effectively this is working for everybody. Obviously not going to work if you can't hear me, but if you can hear me, you can hear me poorly, or you can't see my screen, raise your hand. We've got a couple of questions. The screen and sound look good. Thanks, Rebecca. That's helpful. Okay, and Caroline, you just raise your hand. Have you got a question or is there an issue?
I can't see you.
Would you like to see me?
Yes, I wanted to see. Well, I can't see your screen. I've just got the first slide up, I think. EPA Pro beta training.
That's right. That's exactly what you should have. I haven't
All right,
put,
that's fine.
okay, I'm going to pick back on mute, Caroline. Thank you. I haven't started the presentation yet, but when I do, we'll move through the deck. I'm not going to put. I wasn't going to put video on unless you really want me to. Megan's online as well. Okay, that's great. Thanks, Megan. Okay, I'm not going to put the video on just in case we get any issues with the slowness of the system. And Jane and I haven't done our hair this morning, so we have. I'm only joking. Okay, so everybody else seems to be fine. So we're going to carry on. And just to say before we start the deck, we've got a lot to get through. The day is divided into 2 sections, and although every training session you ever do says not to kill your participants with PowerPoint, I'm afraid there is quite a lot of detail in this deck. And that's important because, yes, I will talk through the information, I'll talk through the processes and what you need to know, but we also wanted you to have a resource that you could then take away and refer back to after the training session today, so you can get additional detail if you need to. So I will summarise and simplify what's on the deck, but I just wanted to make sure that I wanted to raise your awareness to that. Okay, so this is the first session of 2 sessions today. We'll have some natural breaks because it is, I'm very mindful of the fact that it is very difficult to stay focused and attentive through this kind of virtual training reality. So we will have some regular breaks through the sessions, and we'll have an hour's break for lunch. This morning is very much about EPA processes and how things will work in the new world, and I'll talk a little bit more about that this morning. This afternoon is very much systems training and looking at the new system that we're looking to roll out with this new service, this EPA service. As I said, the slides are quite detailed, quite busy, but they will be a good training resource for you to use. And please, if you have any questions, just raise your hands and then I will be able to come to you. I'm just going to make sure that I put the attendance out so I can see you, so I can see if you've got any questions and I can respond to those needs. Right, okay, so EPA, you're all involved in EPA, either as an IEPA or a LEPA for the Business Administration Standard, and thank you very much for all your hard work so far. We've seen a huge scale up in EPA over the last 18 months, and the EPA service has run very successfully. We have scaled up from what was, I think, tens of EPAs in the first year that we offered to offering hundreds and even thousands of EPAs across 52, I think, different standards currently. At this stage, though, as we prepare to scale up further, I think it's important for us to take stock, and that's what we've done, and think a little bit about how, as we scale up over the next 2 to 3 years, how we now need to evolve. In order to deliver an EPA program that will put our customers at the heart of the experience and to give our customers everything they need from registration to issue of results. Now on the screen, I've got the vision for our EPA program of work. Profitable, efficient and market leading, and we really want to put the customer at the heart of what we do, and also respond to the needs of our internal stakeholders, our staff, and also our independent endpoint assessors. So that's our vision, and that is what underpins the work that I'm going to talk to you about today. Okay, moving on. So what we're going to talk about is that really, as we scale up our EPA service, we're looking to re-engineer the service that we offer to our customers, putting the customer experience at the heart. We are aiming to re-engineer our business process and also adopt a new platform, a new IT platform called EPA Pro, to support and facilitate the delivery of this newly imagined EPA service. It's an established platform. It is currently out of the box, and there are other providers using it across the market, and it is specifically designed to support endpoint assessment. Now, the reasons for the evolution, the reason why we need to change, we talked a little bit about the evolution and the scale up of numbers. We want to have a digital service that allows us to offer endpoint assessment end to end. We talked about from registration to issue of results. We want to make the customer experience very simple and easy to use. And EPA Pro is an easy to use application for the customer that supports that EPA journey in a single environment. And in terms of the customers, also this platform in particular has had a lot of positive feedback in the market. Currently, with our EPA Pro service, our EPA service, there are lots of manual steps. So part of our newly imagined EPA service is really about looking at the employee experience as well. So how will the platform and how will our processes support our employees to have a better experience, so they're not having to deal with lots of manual processes long term. We need to operate at scale. So a key component is how we use the technology, EPA Pro, to support that and how we can manage to scale up in an efficient and effective way. As I've already said, we've got a number of manual processes currently that sit around our EPA service, and we need to address that going forward. And EPA Pro will support that. And then finally, probably the most relevant to you as a group of people is the assessor experience. I know from feedback from the LEPAs, from the IEPAs, and also from the associate managers, that a lot of the frustration with EPA Pro for the IEPAs comes from that having to deal with the scheduling, having to deal with a middleman in terms of the scheduling. So currently, the EPA booking team, they drive the scheduling. In the new world, the assessor will have more ownership over that scheduling, and it will allow them to better manage, or allow you to better manage your time. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Okay, so in order to achieve this vision of delivering a newly imagined EPA service, we've developed a program of work. The program of work is called the Darwin Project. Not that you need to know that, but I quite like the name of it. And it is about introducing new business processes and this new technology, EPA Pro, to the business, to our customers, and to all of our stakeholders, assessors and internal staff. Now, it's not an easy thing to do, and we've been working on this for a number of months already. So the first step was for us to reconsider and re-engineer our business processes, to look at how EPA Pro would impact those processes, and to look at how we needed to integrate that new technology. And that part has already been completed. We have new business processes, which I'm going to share with you today. They'll continue to evolve, but we've done that first phase. We've also carried out quite an extensive testing of the business processes and the EPA Pro system through something called a dry run, which is a test, which was completed successfully in December. And we've now come to the third phase of this rollout, this program of work, called the beta phase, and this starts in January 2020, so this starts this month. And the beta phase is very much about going live with this newly imagined EPA service. So yes, we're going to continue to offer our EPA service as is, but we will also be accepting EPA bookings from a small range of customers on a small range of standards on the new platform, using our new business processes. And those apprentices will complete their endpoint assessment from registration through to the issue of results using that new platform. Once we've completed that beta phase, and it's difficult to envisage how long that will take at this point, because we want to see a certain number of customers and a certain number of learners through the whole process. But once we've completed that, we will start to explore how the lessons learned, what we've learned from that beta phase, because the beta is very much about learning and things evolving based on feedback from the people using the system and the processes. Once we've done that, we will look at how we need to roll out this new service, I'm calling it a new service, and technology to our other customers, IEPAs, and across different standards. I'm going to pause there because I've spoken for quite some time. I just want to check if anybody has got any questions so far. If you have, can you just raise your hand? If you haven't, that's fine. You don't have to have any, and I can go on. Okay, that's good. Hopefully that's all clear. Right. So, excuse me. The objective of the training today is, there are a number of objectives. Firstly is to explain the context and the objectives of the EPA Pro beta, so what we're actually doing, so the sort of third stage, and also the context for the project, which I've already mentioned, so why we feel it's important to address and to reimagine the EPA process. I will give you this morning an overview, given that the beta is about rolling out this service to a small range of customers and apprentices. I will provide you, as a group of IEPAs, an overview of the processes, the new processes to accept cases, allocations of apprentices, to manage and complete the assessment in order to carry out the EPA event as part of this new service. This afternoon, there'll be a demonstration and explanation of how to use the IT systems, specifically EPA Pro, to support this process. And then there will be an explanation of some of the feedback that we're looking to get from you through the beta phase. As I said, beta is very much about learning. It's learning for us, it's learning for the customers, it's learning for the IEPAs, and we need to get some feedback from you as to how the processes have worked and how your engagement with technology has worked. This training will also give you the opportunity to ask some questions, if you want to give some initial feedback to us on the training and also what you see. So, okay. Any questions at this point, or anything that isn't there that you expect to see there? If there is, just raise your hand. Okay. So in that case, so just very quickly, this is the morning session. We're going to run from 9:30 to 12:30. We will have some breaks. I've said a mid-morning break, but I'm going to see how it goes. I think there's quite a lot of information, so we might take 2 short breaks rather than 1. And we're focusing, as I said, on the EPA service, so what that looks like, this new service, in this beta phase, the role of the IEPA and some of the changes to the process, and also the support that you get through this process. The afternoon session is very focused towards the technical side. We'll have an hour break for lunch from 12:30 to 1:30. We'll be back sharp at 1:30, where we'll get a walkthrough. There are a number of slides, but also we'll be joined by Libby Timms this afternoon, who's our super user of the new system, and she will give us a walkthrough demonstration of both the IEPA and some LEPA functionality as well. Again, there'll be plenty of breaks this afternoon, and we will sort of round up with some next steps, and there'll be Q&A throughout, so please just raise your hand if you do have a question. Okay, so at that point, I've already spoken a little bit about beta, but let's just talk about in more detail what beta is. So as I said, beta is a small-scale go-live of our new EPA service with the EPA Pro system. It's for selected customers, IEPAs, and apprentices. So this is not a wide-scale rollout across all of our standards, all of our IEPAs. We've handpicked a group of IEPAs to support with this, so thank you very much. And we've also handpicked a group of customers to support with this. And the customers are getting specific support. I think the term is hypercare, in order to sort of nurture them through this process and to make sure that we understand the impact of this new service and system to all of the people that we use. The go live will be the first opportunity to understand really how the systems and processes work with live candidates. We've done plenty of testing, but this is really it's really important that we get the opportunity to take apprentices through the process using the system. So as I've said, it's 3 customers, Paragon, Gen2, and can't remember the third, Hazen. I think that's right. We'll check that. And Northland, 4 customers, 3 initially. 4 standards: business admin, customer service, lead, care worker and the adult care worker too. So 4 standards on Wednesday, which are and those 4 standards have been picked to give us a range of different assessment techniques, a range of different issues, and a range of different volumes as well, because we will need some volume to get an understanding of the whole world. So it's going to happen. We plan to go live on the 27th of January. So from that point, we've got a lot of work to do until then, but from that point, we'll be taking bookings for apprentices on the EPA Pro system. And in theory, we will start to allocate apprentices to IEPA. Now, we don't expect everything to happen on the 27th of January. That's our go live date. But we do expect that after that point, we will start to get some bookings through. And it will probably be a slow scale up as we work through February and into March. We're looking to have, I think, about 150 candidates through the process. That's the number of candidates we're looking to get through the process. So that gives you an idea of the scale. So compared to the BAU, the business as usual process is the way that you're used to doing your endpoint assessment will continue in parallel, and that will carry the bulk of the endpoint assessments. For the beta, we are really looking at a small scale, a small group of people going through this new process. So what were you asked to do? You obviously been asked to attend the training and the process and system training, and following today, there is likely to be another webinar session. It may be recorded, but there will be follow-up training sessions just to remind you of some of the content and to clarify some of the things that may evolve over the next couple of weeks. But this is the key session which will give you the bulk of the content. You'll be asked to review the training and support materials as part of the process. You will get this deck, you will get video guides, you will get other things, and we'll be asking you to review that as you are allocated apprentices to work with. As the endpoint assessment allocations come through, we would like you to accept, to try and schedule some of these in for us and accept those allocations so you get a chance to work through the new process and carry out the assessments as per training today and subsequently. We'd also like you to provide feedback on the processes and the functionality, and we have a really good team of people, Paula and Alex, who will, as you start to work through this, will be in contact with you to ask you some questions about how it's gone, what's happened, how has it gone. You'll also receive probably a survey following your training to get a sense of how well you think the training has prepared you for the new process. So that's what beta is about. Any questions at this point? I'm just going to pause and glance through the attendees. I think we are all ladies today, actually. So, and no questions. That's good. I think we just check the staff. No questions. Okay. So at that point, we will continue further. Okay. So key stakeholders in this, and these key stakeholders are probably no different to the stakeholders you already know. You work on EPA currently through our current processes, so you know who the IEPAs are, the assessors, and their role in this process, this new service, is pretty much the same as it was. Fundamentally, the principal role is to carry out the assessment and to make a judgment on the apprentice's evidence and, where necessary, to provide fail feedback. That hasn't changed. What has changed is that you will have a bigger role in scheduling some of this assessment days according to your availability. The EPA booking team based in Burntwood, they, again, you are probably used to working with them already. They will be providing technical support to you as IEPAs and customers on the event. You're probably used to speaking to the group, the team there, and that will continue. They will be on hand to support you through the process for organising the event, carrying out the event, and any associated activity. They will also be the team responsible for allocating EPA events to you as assessors. We'll talk more about that allocation process later, but that EPA booking team has a role in that. And they'll also be providing support in booking GoToMeeting events. So where we have remote assessments and we use GoToMeeting, they will be booking and providing support with that which won't change initially at least. The LEPA, we know the LEPA is the lead independent assessor. I think we've got 2 on the line today, so good morning. The LEPA quality assures the work of the IEPA and provides technical support and guidance on the assessment. And they also release the results to the customer in that they QA the work of the IEPA, and if they're happy with that, the action that the LEPA takes will release the results to the customer. The associate management team, so Rebecca, Lorraine, Tracy, Jane, and the rest of our coordinators and admins, they support through recruitment training, standardisation of you as IEPAs and LEPAs, and then the preparation for your EPA activity in that respect. Also supporting the quality process. So that doesn't change in the world. And also the EPA gateway team, they process the gateway applications to make sure all of the apprentices, all of the criteria for each apprentice has been met, so the apprentice can proceed. Again, that won't change. So a lot of the key stakeholders are the same in the new world. There's just some tweaks to some of the activity that they will do. So bear with us. So it's rather pretty slide. I'm just going to try and see it. Right, so we talked a little bit about what's different in the service. Well, fundamentally, what's different for the IEPA is as follows. Currently, we have an IEPA, guaranteed and badged by City and Guilds, who's been trained and standardised, and we have an EPA booking team, and we have a customer. And that EPA booking team is really the middleman between that endpoint assessor and customer in terms of allocating, booking, and scheduling. And what I think you are probably aware of is that in that respect, the EPA booking team plays a role of contacting the customer, getting dates, matching that with the IEPA. Any changes then they have to broker between the two parties. And that often leads to a lot of back and forth and a lot of additional emails and phone calls in order to make sure that the scheduling needs of this person meet the scheduling needs of our customers. And that's currently how it stands. Going forward with the new service, it will work differently. So in terms of EPA scheduling, so the case, first of all, the platform you'll be using for the Vita is EPA Pro, which is different. But the EPA booking team will allocate cases to IEPAs. They'll allocate them different cases. And when I say a case, what I mean is an apprentice. An apprentice is a case or a caseload. And it will be allocated to the IEPA based on some understanding by the EPA team as to what the availability of that endpoint assessor is. Excuse me. That IEPA can reject or accept that case based on their understanding of their scheduling, of their timetable. But once they do accept that case, then the scheduling of the endpoint assessments is something that happens between the endpoint assessor and the customer directly. So we take the middleman out and we allow the assessor, using their diary, to work with the customer directly to schedule the necessary events. Of course, all of that process is supported by the endpoint assessment booking team. They run into problems, they're struggling to get customers to respond, and the EPA booking team will support that. Fundamentally, what we envisage is that taking out this middleman in terms of scheduling will make that scheduling process more efficient for the customer and also for the endpoint assessor, because they best know their timetable and what they're able to achieve in terms of the different parts of the assessment. Okay, that's a fundamental difference. I'm going to stop there to give you a chance to ask any questions if you want to. Please raise your hand if you do have any questions. No? Okay, I think that's positive. We're going to take it as positive. So if we're all okay, we can move So I'm going to talk you through an overview of the assessment process, and you'll see that actually fundamentally it's very similar to the current process, but this is an overview of how it will work with the new service. So as I've already said, a caseload or a case is allocated to the assessor. It might be one case, it might be a number of cases. So if we have a particular provider that has a number of apprentices all reaching completion at the same time, and they want to sort of group those apprentices together to make best use of the IEPA time, there could be a number of cases that are offered to an assessor to be allocated. And based on what the IEPA knows about their availability, their own diary, the IEPA can accept the case or reject the case. Now, what we'd envisage, as I've already said, is the EPA booking team, because they work closely with the IEPAs and because they know what they've already allocated, the system will tell them that, they will have some insight and intelligence as to what they can allocate. So there's more likelihood of making that allocation a success. It's more likely that the IEPA will success that caseload, will accept that caseload, sorry. So once the IEPA accepts the case, that is them saying, okay, well, this is now my case. I am going to see this through the steps that it needs to take in order for that assessment to take place. The first step towards doing that is that the IEPA will to contact the provider, and they'll be given the contact details by the assessment team, to set up what we call a planning meeting. Now, the planning meeting is a virtual meeting. It happens remotely, but it's a really important first step in that endpoint assessment process through this new service, because that is the occasion, that is the time when the endpoint assessor, the IEPA, will sit down with the provider and possibly the apprentice and employer to look at the assessments and the dates that need to be scheduled, and to arrange the dates for the different components, the different assessment methods that need to be planned. That happens during the planning meeting. So once that planning meeting has happened and the dates have been agreed, then the IEPA will conduct the assessments. As normal, this happens currently. We need your judgment, your expertise to be able to assess the learner evidence. Some of the evidence is uploaded by the customer. Some of the evidence is generated by the IEPA when they observe events remotely or they go to a practical site. So the assessments take place as normal. And then, where appropriate, once for each component, once the IEPA has derived a judgment, that judgment is entered on to the EPA Pro platform, along with any feedback where appropriate. And currently we offer fail feedback for where learners have failed a particular, where apprentices failed a component. So that result and fail feedback is entered onto the platform. And then the next step is that where necessary, the people will then quality assure that and will release the assessment. Now, the key difference, and I'll talk about this throughout the morning, is that currently all of the results for each of the component assessment, each of the assessment methods, are held until the apprentice completes all of the components, and then the result is released for the overall endpoint assessment at the end. In the new world, what we aim to do is that for each component assessment, the result will be derived, quality assured if necessary, and then where it's approved, it will be released along with any fail feedback to the customer. So we'll be releasing results at a component level. Once all the assessments are completed successfully, the IEPA then would do the job that they currently do, which is to work out the overall results, and that result would be entered onto the platform. Again, where necessary, the legal would quality assure this, and once they've done that, they would release the overall results to the customer, and that happens through Pro. So that gives you just a very, I'll go into more detail on those stages, but I just wanted to give you an overview of the whole process end to end. Again, I'm going to pause here because there are a couple of revelations about how things will work, just to give you the opportunity to ask any questions. If you have any questions, please raise your hand. Okay. You did have a question. Hello, Elizabeth.
Hello. In the BA standard, we have the remote, we have the online knowledge test. We're not getting involved with that, presumably, are we?
No, we're not. You're not getting involved with the knowledge test. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. When I go through each of the processes. So that doesn't change. The customer is responsible for booking the knowledge test in the way that they currently book it. But we will, as we talk through the process, there is something that we do need to consider with the Evolve test, which I'll talk through as we walk through the detail this morning. If that's all right, Elizabeth.
That's fine.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay. Right, at that point, I'm going to take a sip of water because I've been talking for a very long time. And give us the chance to move on. Okay, so I'm going to talk to now, just to underline some of the changes between the current process and the new process for beta for EPA. I've spoken about some of these, but I think it's important that I highlight them to you. So we've talked currently, the EPA booking team would set the assessment dates based on your availability. In the new world, the IEPA will own that process. You are in charge of your diary, and setting the assessment date, so when the assessments take place, will happen through a planning meeting directly with the provider, between the IEPA and the provider. That is different currently. And the reason for that, as I said, is really to give more ownership to the IEPA, to allow them to schedule things as required, and to take out that additional back and forth between the sort of middleman of the EPA team. Currently, our assessment documents, and when I say assessment documents, I mean two types of assessment documents. So the assessment documents are the documents that you as IEPAs use to assess the candidates. They are the documents that the customer might submit to you on behalf of the learner, for example, a portfolio, which I think is very relevant for business admin. And they are also documents that you as an IEPA might generate, assessment documents, as you work through the assessment process. So if you are conducting an interview, or if you're conducting, if you're observing a presentation remotely, you as an assessor would be completing forms that will help you reach your overall judgment. And these, I've just spotted a typo, I'm going to draw your attention to it. These are stored, so these are the assessor documents. So there are two types of documents. Now, currently, they are all stored on LA. For beta, it's important that I emphasise this. We need to see how this works. But currently for beta, these documents will be stored in two different places. The EPA Pro system will accept learner evidence from the customer. So the portfolio, the learner's portfolio, will be available on EPA Pro. The assessor documents that are produced by the assessor will obviously be available on your own computers, but we will store all of those documents and alongside any feedback on a system called SharePoint. And that system will allow you to share those documents with our lead assessors. Currently, within EPA Pro, there isn't a facility to do that, but as I said, that's something that we are looking to work on through beta and as we move forward for the project. But for beta, assessor documents that are produced by the assessor will be shared with the LEPA on SharePoint, but all of the learner materials will be available on EPA Pro. We spoke about the EPA results. As I've already said to you, in the old world, or in the current world, the results are released once all the relevant assessments have been completed, and that will then give the candidate a chance to resit. With the new service, we are looking to release the results once each assessment has been completed, and that will allow the learners to get more immediate feedback, and it will allow them to plan their next steps in terms of resits and rescheduling. The component so individual assessments are released after each result has been derived, rather than waiting until everything's been completed and releasing an overall result. Fail feedback. Now, fail feedback is currently released to customers once all of the EPA assessments have been completed. Obviously, as we are now releasing component results, so results for each assessment method, then where necessary, fail feedback will be targeted for that individual component and will be released after each assessment where it's appropriate, where candidates have failed. The EPA booking team currently reschedule existing bookings and set dates for resits. As I've already said, because the IEPA owns the process of scheduling the assessment dates, if resits are necessary, the IEPA will work with the provider directly to set dates for those subsequent assessments. So where they need to reschedule, the IEPA will work with the provider directly rather than working with the EPA team, who will act as a broker between the customer and so it's a much more direct process. Currently, GoToMeeting events that we use for remote assessments, for example, the presentation, the project presentation, or the interview, are organised by the EPA booking team. Now, in the first phase of beta, there is no change to that. So the events will continue to be set up by the EPA booking team. But what we would like to do through beta is to assess whether it's efficient for everybody, for the IEPAs included, for that to be organised instead by the IEPA. So instead of the IEPA requesting this to be set up by the EPA team, in the second phase of beta, we'd like to explore whether that is better for all of the people involved, that happens by the IEPA. That's the second phase. Initially, all of the GoToMeeting meetings that are needed will be set up by the EPA booking team. There's no change there. Okay, there's quite a lot of information there, so I'm going to pause and give you the opportunity to ask any questions. Just raise your hand if you do have any questions, or if you want to highlight anything that you think I've missed. I'm speaking specifically to Rebecca or to Lorraine or Jane. Okay. Hi, Sylvia.
Hi, Rachel. I just want to clarify the assessors contacting the customer and presume this will be by email, and that, as is normal now, nothing except arranging dates and times will be discussed. Because
Yes.
I have a feeling there will be customers, especially if there's been a fail, that will be wanting to ask the assessors, well, where did we go wrong and what does the apprentice need to do? And I think we need to be absolutely concrete, if you like, to make sure that we only discuss dates and times.
I absolutely agree with you, Sylvia. That was one of our initial concerns, is that, and with the best will in the world, you know, the customers, they want to find out more information about something, but the IEPA's role is very clear. It's very important that the IEPA retains that independence in order to be able to make an independent judgment, and also not to be put on the spot, to be drilled or asked questions. So that is not their role. Their role in contacting the provider will be to set dates and to agree those dates, and also to carry out the assessments. We are doing very specific training with the customers, and we will be monitoring this through the beta. So we're doing very explicit training, and we have a very specific support model in place for customers, where they will have you know, contact, support, frontline support, and we will also have we'll be giving instruction to the IEPA that if their customer is starting to sort of stray beyond that line and ask specific questions about other things, they will just channel those queries directly to customer services, and that's City and Guilds as an organisation will pick that up. So we need to, we A, making that very clear to customers. We will B, make sure there is a support mechanism in place so that the IEPA has a channel to make sure those queries go in the right direction. And 3, we'll be monitoring this very carefully through the beta, because I agree that is a potential risk. Does that answer your question, Sylvia?
Yes, very much. Thank you very much.
Okay, any other questions from anybody? I'm going to give you a chance to digest that and possibly flag any questions, any concerns. Okay, I think we're okay to go on. Right, just give me a minute while I move on. So, speaking really about one of the points that I've just highlighted to you, about the IT systems for beta. As I've already said, in terms of sharing assessment documentation with the LEPA, there are some limitations currently with EPA Pro, but we are looking to explore this as we move through the beta. So EPA Pro does almost everything for us and everything for the customers. So in terms of customer registration and booking, allocation of the EPA cases to assessors is done through the system. Booking of assessment dates is also done on EPA Pro. Where the customer submits learner evidence, for example, their portfolios, that's submitted through EPA Pro. And then the noting of the assessor judgments and the provision of feedback to the customer also happens through the system. Currently, that feedback needs to be sent out separately and needs to be emailed out, so that is a definite improvement. And the quality assurance of the IEPA judgments by the LEPA is also carried out through EPA Pro. And then finally, the issue of the results to the customer. And the issue of the results to the customer is much more immediate. Currently, there are a number of manual steps that have to be taken between the overall result being derived and then being put back into our systems and being released to the customer through your garden. That EPA Pro system does a lot of the current steps that we need it to do in order to make that a seamless process for the customer and also for the IEPA. However, as I've already highlighted, through beta, there is one element that we will not be using EPA Pro to do. And that's because it doesn't currently allow us to do this. And that is the storage of any assessment documentation that we don't share with the customer. We can share documentation on EPA Pro, but if we do, it is automatically shared with the customer. So we've decided that for beta, we will store assessment documentation that is not to be shared with the customer. So, for example, the go-to meeting recordings from interviews, assessor observation forms will all be stored on SharePoint. And there will be some training for you at the end of this session on how to use that system. It's a very simple system, but putting the information there will mean that the LEPAs, EQA bodies, AMs will have access to that information and it will be secure. Now, currently for beta, we envisage we'll be using these two systems alongside each other and we'll have training in both of those. But we will monitor this through the beta because ideally we'd like to work towards having all of the documentation in one place. Other systems that we'll talk about today, which you're probably all aware of, is Walled Garden, which is the IT system that the customers use to book Evolve tests. That will not change. And GoToMeeting, which is the software that we use to support remote planning meetings. So when we walk through the processes this morning and the systems this afternoon, they will be the key systems that we'll be referring to. Again, I'm going to give you the pause there and give you the chance to ask any questions if you can. Questions? I'll move on. Okay, so business admin. There are 4 assessment methods for business admin, and you might hear me call them assessment components. So I interchange those. So there are 4 components in order to complete the endpoint assessment. There's an evolve test, which is advisable that needs to be set first. There is a portfolio, and the evidence for that portfolio needs to be uploaded by the customer 2 weeks before it's due to be assessed. There is an interview based on that portfolio, which is conducted remotely with the apprentice in attendance, and a presentation and QA, again with the apprentice in attendance. I understand from the associate manager, Rebecca and Lorraine, that I think under certain circumstances the apprentice may request to have somebody else attend those components, those assessments, but predominantly it is the apprentice only in attendance at those events. Now, the sequence of assessments are obviously pertinent to each of our standards, because for each of our standards, it is slightly different. There could be different assessment methods, and there could be different requirements and criteria in terms of the sequence. But for business admin, as I understand it, that is currently the process. It's important, and I know you as IEPAs are aware of this, and it's important that we focus on this, because in terms of the scheduling of the assessment events, this information is important for the IEPA and for the customer when it comes to setting the different dates of the assessments within the endpoint assessment. That this information will drive the scheduling activity between the IEPA and the customer. Any comments or any thoughts there before I move on, just in case I made any mistakes? No? Good. Oh, there is a Sylvia, hi.
Sorry, it's me again.
Very pleased you're asking questions, it's good.
It's just that you've got section 2, the portfolio, and the evidence needs to be uploaded 2 weeks before, which is correct. But you haven't got in there for the presentation and QA that the support document needs to be uploaded 2 weeks before as well. And I'm just wary that if this particular slide is shared with customers, they're going to overlook that.
It's not shared with customers, Sylvia. So just
yes,
so
the thing is, this information is incorrect, because it's not just the portfolio evidence that needs to be submitted 2 weeks before, it's the support document as well for section 4.
Okay, and thank you for highlighting that. I appreciate that. What we'll do is we will amend it after the presentation, and I'll refer to that. So in terms of the presentation, there is a support document which needs to be 2 weeks before that assessment will take place.
Thank you.
Yeah, and that is important to underline. And apologies if that has caused any confusion.
No, not at all. I was just a bit concerned, Rachel, that if the customers were getting similar information, they'll overlook it. And it is the one component that most customers forget to submit, and we're often having to ask the EPA team to ask the customer to send the support document in.
It's a good point to raise, Sylvia. This deck is not for the customers, and in fact, this deck will evolve a little bit further over the next couple of weeks, because as I said at the beginning, there are some things which we're still dotting the I's and crossing the T's. That's important information that we need to underline, so I will do that afterwards. But again, as Sylvia has said, that will drive the scheduling activity. So it's important that you as experts know this, because when it comes to setting the dates, then that will be key information to bear in mind. Because, for example, we wouldn't want to schedule something out of sequence. In some of our standards, for example, the evolve test being sat first is absolutely essential. And there are certain gaps that need to happen between the assessments, so that is important to take into account. So you have this information as IEPAs, but we will update the deck before we send it out to you. Right? Okay, so I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take a very, very quick comfort break before we start to go through the detailed business process. So I'm going to take a comfort break until about 10:30. So if you want to just freshen up your cup of tea, stretch legs, use the facilities, do that, and I will be back at 10:30 and we'll start to talk through the processes. So just bear with me for 5 minutes and we'll be at 10:30. Okay, welcome back everybody. Hopefully you managed to stretch your legs a little bit. We're going to start with a question from Louise. Just get your question up. So what you've asked is, quite often the evidence comes in late. Is it the IEPA's role then to chase this? How flexible is the IEPA permitted to be on the basis that some come in late? Okay, I think first of all, if there are consistent issues with a customer submitting things late, then that is an escalation to the EPA booking team. And it will be their job to work with the customer, to speak to the customer about that. And we are looking to bringing much more specific guidelines around, under what circumstances if things are late, or that assessments don't happen for various reasons, that they will still get charged for certain things. So we're looking to put in place incentives for the customer to actually meet their obligations in terms of submitting. So that will happen through BETA. The other thing, though, is I think in terms of the IEPA, if you're awaiting assessment material, then the first step would be to, and it's a day late, it's 2 days late. The first step would be to ping a reminder email to your contact to say, is the evidence there? If you don't get a response, or if it is late, then you would escalate that to the EPA booking team. And I think in terms of flexibility, and then the EPA booking team would take over that conversation, because what I don't want the IEPAs to do is to start to get involved in, when you can do this, why haven't you done this? And that is the job of City and Guilds to chase and sort that out. In terms of being flexible about if things do come in late, the 2 weeks are there to allow you the time to be able to review the evidence. If something is a day or 2 days late and you still feel you're able to do that, then I think that's fine and you can continue with the assessment. But I still think it's worth letting the EPA booking team know if you have persistent offenders who constantly submit things 1 or 2 days late, because that is adding more work for the IEPA, and that shouldn't happen. The customers are being persuaded and encouraged very strongly that they have to meet their obligations, and we know this is a current problem. That's my answer to your question, Louise, but I'm just going to give you the opportunity if you want to come back on that or ask me further questions. Does anybody want to raise their hand, or does that answer your question? Hopefully that answers your question. Okay. All right. Well, so at that point, we'll proceed. Just make sure. Fine. Sorry, I've just muted myself. I was talking away very nicely. Answering, Louise has just come back on a separate point and said, I think it's important that we train people to be clear what they can and can't say to the provider. And I agree with you there, Louise. I think that will be part of the learning that we get through BETA, but I do think we will need to be very explicit when it comes to interactions with the customer, what the IEPA can and can't say. I do agree with you. Okay, the screen's just lost the screen. Right, is the screen back? Don't think so, Sylvia. Everything right? Good. All right. I'm not quite sure what happened there, whether it was me clicking the wrong buttons or just weird gremlins in the system. I'm going to put it under gremlins because I'm sure it wasn't me. Okay. Let me see if there's any other questions. There are some more. Good. I think that is it. So let's just put these in. Just moving the question to the screen so I can see. Right, let's move on. Any other comments or thoughts from people before we respond? Raise your hand if there is. Okay. Right, excuse me, just need a sip of something. Okay, so we're starting simple. I'm sorry about the faceless images that I've got to represent the IEPAs, but I wanted to make, because there's a lot of text on these slides, I wanted to give you at least some pictures to look at. So as we've already said, in terms of allocating EPA cases, so we talk about the IEPAs having a caseload. So they have a series of apprentices that have been allocated to them that they've accepted, and they are then taken through the assessment process. So the allocation of the EPA cases, they come from the EPA booking team. They're based on the same criteria. The apprentices will still need to meet the gateway obligations, and they shouldn't be allocated unless they have. One or two sometimes slip through the net, but generally, once they've gone through gateway, the EPA team will then be free to allocate them to IEPAs, and they will be allocating to the IEPAs based on their understanding of the IEPA availability. The hub currently has your availability information, and they talk to you, they may call you, they might have a conversation. If they know there's a block of work happening in a certain provider at a certain time of year, they may speak to you on the phone about that before they allocate them to you on the system. But once they have a clear understanding, you will be allocated on EPA Pro a case or cases, which is basically one or a series of apprentices to offer, and you'll be given information about the location, who the apprentice is, the provider is, etc. And on the basis of the information you get on the system, you can then accept that case or you can reject it. And if you reject it, the EPA booking team will reallocate that case to a different IEPA. And the EPA booking team has got several pieces of information in the portal too. So, your location with respect to the endpoint assessment, your current caseload, so how many cases you currently have, so that they're able to make sure that they distribute the cases in the right way and spread them across the pool of assessors, making sure that certain people are not overloaded and others have limited application. That's the theory. As I said, if there are a number of apprentices, you might be allocated a number at one point, or you might just be allocated one. If you accept an allocation on the system, but then something happens, which sometimes does, we'd encourage you not to accept unless you feel very confident that you'll be able to complete the assessment. But if you do, you can then reject the allocation on the system, but you will need to let your LEPA and the EPA booking team know, so they can do the necessary system work to make sure that they reallocate that case. Okay, any questions at this point? I have a very irritating cough. I hope this doesn't turn into a Theresa May like delivery. I've got some water, thank you, Jane. Okay, right, so at that point we'll move on. There's no more questions. So, and this is where we move to. So if I go back a step, sorry, I just wanted to highlight that once you've accepted your case, you will have the contact details of who to contact in the provider from the EPA team and from the system. And once you accept that case, you need to proceed with the EPA scheduling, and that happens through a planning meeting. I've mentioned a planning meeting. Now, it's not an on-site meeting, it's a remote get-together through GoToMeeting of you and the provider mostly to just set the dates that you're available to do the assessment. But it's called a planning meeting, so when you hear me refer to that, that's what I mean. So what is a planning meeting? Now, the planning meeting is set up by your IEPA, by you, to agree the dates, locations and attendees of each individual assessment method or component that makes up that endpoint assessment. It's conducted remotely using GoToMeeting, and people can attend from different locations because of that. It's always attended by the IEPA and the provider, and it may also be attended by the employer and the apprentice, and that really is up to how the provider is organising it. They may choose that the apprentice or apprentices also attend that planning meeting. And there are a number of reasons for doing that, is that they get the chance to meet the IEPA in advance. The IEPA can set the scene a little bit of the assessment. They can talk about the different components that need to be scheduled. And it'll be a chance for the IEPA to flag any important considerations. things like assessment materials that need to be submitted in advance of the assessment. So that's a really good opportunity for business admin, Sylvia, given that you've highlighted it, to highlight that the portfolio needs to be submitted 2 weeks in advance, but also the other materials will also need, for the other components will need to be submitted then. It's a good point for us to be able to highlight that to the provider. Excuse me. After the planning meeting, and that's on the data set, any changes to dates that are caused by resits or by issues can be just arranged with a phone call with the provider, between the provider and the paper. So if something does come up, then there's not the need to set up a planning meeting formally. It's a phone conversation. As with the assessment dates, once the planning meeting date is set, it's really important to make sure that the IEPA fulfills that commitment. So I don't want the reason that the planning meeting is to be cancelled to be because of issues with the IEPA's diary. We need to make sure we fulfil that commitment where we can. Obviously things come up, but it's important that we do our best. And given that the scheduling is in your remit and your gift, I'm hoping that will support with that. So, excuse me, take a drink. So that is the planning meeting. Can I pause there and give you the chance to ask any questions or flag any concerns? Tracy, I'm going to bring you in.
Hi, I just wanted to know, do you have a rough time scale of how forward this planning meeting will happen, or time scales?
How forward? Sorry, how
far in advance before the rough? I mean, I know there's obviously 30 days. They've put their booking in. So when would you roughly think that the planning meeting will take place? 2 weeks, 3 weeks?
We have, good question, Tracy. What we are hoping, and I'll go through some of these key timelines that we're hoping to implement, is that from when the IEPA accepts the allocation, is that a planning meeting will have taken place within 2 weeks. It's a remote event. It can be squeezed in, into certain diaries, but we would aim for the planning meeting to have taken place from 2 weeks of accepting that allocation. Does that give you an idea?
Yep, thank you.
That doesn't tell us when the assessment dates need to take place, but it is about getting that initial planning meeting in so those assessment dates can be. Just going to look, I've got another question. Just bear with me a second. Will the planning meeting be recorded and will this be subject to QA? Louise, no, we don't envisage that the planning meeting will be recorded. It is really, in most cases, it will be a conversation with the provider and the IEPA about setting dates and reminding them of key timelines for submitting evidence, exactly. So we don't envisage it will be recorded. I think it's important that we put a kind of a sample script together, so it'll give the IEPAs an idea of how to approach that, but we don't envisage it'll be recorded or it will be subject to QA because it's really just a conversation. Hopefully that answers your question. Any other questions or points that people want to raise? We've got a question. Okay, so the question is, are we to assume that if a learner is present during the planning meeting, that we'll only be allowed to book a date for that specific learner? The provider may wish to set dates for more than one apprentice. Would there have to be a separate meeting for each apprentice? All good questions, Claire. I think if you are doing a number of apprentices at a provider in a certain timescale, we would envisage there'd be one planning meeting. So one planning meeting to talk about a range of apprentices that you've been allocated. That would be an efficient use of time. In theory, the provider could ask the apprentice to attend. They may very well, but if they are keen to set the planning meeting to happen as quickly as possible and then to set the EPA off on its journey, so to get the dates in the diary, it might be more efficient for the provider to exclude the apprentice from that meeting. We don't have a view of how likely that is to be yet. I think they'll need to measure that through the beta. there won't need to be separate meetings, that all of the apprentices could be in one meeting. The dates are predominantly set between the provider and the IEPA, and that the provider we'd expect the provider to come to that meeting, or to attend that meeting with an idea of the availability of resources and apprentices. So that can then be compared to the IEPA's availability. We wouldn't expect to do a kind of round the table, so when are you free? We expect that information to be brought to the meeting so it can be discussed quite effectively at the meeting. As I said, we don't know yet how many of those providers will choose to let their apprentices attend. If there's one apprentice, they might very well. If there are a number, we envisage that the scheduling job directly with the IEPA will just be a conversation between those two parties. Okay. Any other questions at this point? One thing to say, and I'm setting myself up nicely, just in case somebody asks me a question I can't answer, I don't have all the answers. We are very much learning as we go along, and we will continue to learn over the next 3, 4, 5 weeks and through the beta. So things will evolve. It will evolve based on your feedback. It will evolve based on the customer feedback and staff feedback and what we learn about the system and efficient ways of working. And if there are any questions I can't answer today because you've raised something that we just haven't thought of, which is possible, you are after all the experts in this field, then what I will make a commitment to do is to take the question away and come back to you, and we'll provide an answer as soon as we can. Okay, any other points? Hands up. Need me to answer any more questions? Okay, at that point I'm going to go on. Okay, so this is really, so in order to set up a planning meeting, we would envisage that the IEPA would contact the contact they've been given by the EPA team. We've got a template email for that contact. So what we would like, so this is about setting up the planning meeting. This is the planning meeting initiates that scheduling. We need to get the planning meeting in the diary. So we envisage that the IEPA would contact the provider. They would contact, the email talks about why a planning meeting is necessary, but the customers will have training in this, so they'll be aware of this need. And we'd ask you to propose at least 3 options for a planning meeting date in that template. The template talks a little bit about what the planning meeting is and what it does. And as I said there, that SLA, it talks about the planning meeting should take place, we should aim for it to take place within 10 days of accepting that EPA allocation. Now, how feasible these timelines are, it's difficult to judge, but we will, as I said, continue to monitor that through beta. That's a template, and this is one of the tools that we'll provide to you through, in preparation for the beta and through the beta. Any questions? Hands up. Got a couple of hands up. Caroline. Caroline, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. It's okay.
Okay. Questions answered? Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you. Elizabeth, I'm going to take you off mute. Elizabeth.
Hi. Please find a short bio at the end of this email.
Yeah. No, that's a good question. So we've been talking about this internally. I'm just going to put you back on mute again. A little bit into the back, Elizabeth. So if you, I'll put your hand out. If you want to come back to me, then you can raise it again. Okay. We talked a little bit about this. This isn't the final sample, but we talked a little bit whether it's possible for the IEPA to provide just a short explanation of who they are to at the bottom of that planning meeting. We've got some samples of what that might look like, and what we'd like to do is to share those with you to see whether you'd be happy to do that. Some people refer to their LinkedIn page, could refer to their LinkedIn page if they have one. So I think that needs a bit more discussion. It's in there currently, but I think we'd like to talk to a few of you after the training to understand, you know, what we could put in there and what benefit that would bring. It's currently in the sample, but I think that needs more discussion. Does that answer your question? assuming your hands are down, so I assume it has. Come back to me if it hasn't. Caroline, your hand's up. Did you want to ask me a question?
Sorry.
Oh, don't worry, I'll take it down.
It's all right. I've pressed it by mistake.
No worries. Okay, I've got another question. Let me just go back to our question pane. The letter reads as it is face-to-face. Okay, Louise, if it does read as it is face-to-face, I said this is just a sample at the minute. The final version of the template will need to be put together before we go live. So all of these contact emails will need to be reviewed. So please don't worry about that. It's not a face-to-face meeting. Let me just confirm that. I think if you had to visit every provider as well as doing the endpoint assessment, it would be very difficult. So it is a remote meeting. So if that reads incorrectly in the letter, then that will be amended. The final templates will all be part of a pack of resources that we'd like to share with you before we go live. Okay, any other questions? Any other comments? Just going to make some notes. Just bear with me a second. I'm just going to leave you. Yeah, this has come back. Another question? Yeah, talking again about the bio, I would agree that if we, as I said, the bio is an idea. It was an idea from the customer-facing team because we've had lots of feedback from customers as to it helps a little bit with nerves for the apprentice to understand who the IEP is. And if we do go down that road, there will be some guidance around it. We'll be very specific about the information that we want to use in it, and it will need to be signed off before it is used. So I don't want you to worry about that yet, because I'm not 100% sure we're going to use that. But if we do decide that a bio is attached to that contact email, it will be quality assured and signed off before it is used. Okay. Sorry. Give me a second. Any other questions? Just scrolling through the list of people. Good. Okay, this is a very busy slide. Apologies for this. So we'll talk through it slowly. So the planning meeting process. As I've said, the planning, once you've sent your email to the provider should come back with a confirmation that one of the dates that you proposed works for them. If relevant, the apprentice will also attend that, but as I said already, we're unsure as to how frequently that will happen. This is a good proportion of our providers will want to carry out that scheduling planning meeting without the apprentice present, but they have that option. Once you have your planning meeting in the dates in the diary, you will send a request to the EPA booking team to set up a go-to-meeting event for that planning meeting that they have directly. The EPA booking team will use the information that they have to set up the go-to-meeting event, and notifications and event links will be sent to all of the attendees that will be attending that planning meeting. Now, you have the date of the planning meeting, and you have some information on the planning meeting. The next stage is really for you to set the planning meeting up in EPA Pro. So in order for the assessments to be scheduled, the date of the planning meeting needs to be set in EPA Pro, as well as GoToMeeting. So it's the IEPA's job just to put the information into EPA Pro. This is the date of the planning meeting. These are the people attending, and then the system will also send the customer a notification, and the planning meeting date will be confirmed to them. The planning meeting takes place remotely, and during that meeting, assessment dates and attendees are agreed for all of the components, so all of the assessment methods. So there are 4 assessment methods for business admin, so they will be agreed for all of those 4 assessment methods. And what we envisage is that we've put together a template that the IEPA can use during that planning meeting to guide their discussion. talked about a script, but there's currently a template, a sample template that we've put together that will help the IEPA run that meeting and will ensure that they gather the right information at that meeting in order to be able to proceed with the assessment. So once that planning meeting has been conducted and the IEPA has the information, the IEPA would then set the dates up on EPA Pro, so it would add the dates and assessments to EPA Pro. Now going forward, because the system is quite intuitive and simple to use, we envisage that as the planning meeting is taking place, the IEPA can put the dates immediately into EPA Pro. But initially, what we'd recommend is that during the planning meeting, the IEPA gathers the information they need on the template and then would subsequently add that information to EPA Pro after the planning meeting. I think that's important initially because it's a new system and it's a new way of working. If there are any remote assessments to be set up, which there are for business admin, again, a request is sent to the EPA booking team to make sure that the GoToMeeting events are set up in support of those assessment dates. Once those GoToMeeting events are set up, the participants will receive the notifications from GoToMeeting, the links to be able to access those assessments. Okay, so some points to underline. Now, currently, on the system as it stands, even if you have one planning meeting for a number of apprentices that takes place physically, when you put the planning meeting date into EPA Pro, which is here, when you put the planning meeting date into EPA Pro, which is here, a planning meeting date needs to be set against every apprentice that is attending. It's the same date, but currently the system requires us to put a date against a planning meeting date against each of the apprentices, even if they're attending all the same meeting. That's important to underline. If the customer gateway evidence fails, in theory, the assessment shouldn't be allocated, but if it does, and you've already accepted the allocation, it could be that the EPA booking team asks you to pause on proceeding that assessment and ask you either to cancel or to postpone the planning meeting or not to proceed with that if something has been allocated without passing gateway. But in theory, that shouldn't. As I've said, initially, the EPA booking team will schedule GoToMeetings for the IEPAs, but this might change through beta, and it will depend a bit on the feedback that we get from you as IEPAs through the beta. If you find that it's more efficient and easier for you to set up the GoToMeetings directly, if you're used to using that system and are familiar with it and are comfortable with it, then we'd like to review that through the beta and allow certain IEPAs the chance to set up those GoToMeetings directly. But I think there's a lot of change initially, so we'd like to review that as we move to the beta and decide whether that's the best path to take. So initially, all of the meetings that you need to be set up on GoToMeeting will be set up by the EPA booking team. As I've said, initially, the IEPA, during that planning meeting, the IEPA will collect all key planning information on meeting recording forms. So we've got a template that will facilitate the IEPA's conversation through that planning meeting, and then input the information onto EPA Pro after. Again, with familiarity, because it's quite a simple step on the system, and we will show you that this afternoon. It's possible that the IEPA could just enter into EPA Pro during the planning meeting and enter those dates there and then, gather the information and enter it directly into the system. But we think initially it's important that there's some support. So we envisage that the information will be collected through the meeting and then input by the IEPA onto EPA Pro. For the showcase portfolio, so when we are assessing the showcase portfolio, and also, as Sylvia said, some of the other components, I think it was the interview, change contracts, improve the project presentation. Where there is assessment evidence that needs to be uploaded in advance, the date that you set during that planning meeting is when you aim to assess it. So if, for example, you set the date of, let me think, the 24th of February to do the assessment of the portfolio, within the system, there is already a rule which says that the evidence needs to be uploaded 2 weeks before. So if you set the 24th of February, 2 weeks before that, on the 10th of February, sorry, the customer will get a reminder, a notification on the platform that they need to upload evidence. They will get that reminder. But I think that's something also important to flag in the planning meeting. As Sylvia said, there are lots of issues with customers not inputting the evidence in time. So if this can be further emphasised during the planning meeting, I think it's a good opportunity to do that. Okay, I'm going to pause there and give you the chance. There's quite a lot of information there, so I'm going to give you a chance to ask any questions you need to. Give me a second. Or raise your hand if anything isn't clear. Okay. Clear? I'm hoping that it is. Please don't be afraid to raise your hand, and if you prefer to, just raise a question in private, and I can answer that to everybody. Okay, so it's clear for everybody. So we will go on. Just compute slides and open up and have some more water. Okay, so on this page, what we've got is an example, and again, this is a sample. It was the initial drafts. We will amend these based on feedback, feedback from different stakeholders, LEPAs, IEPAs, and also our associate managers. But this is an initial meeting recording form, what we would envisage during the session, during the planning meeting, that the IEPA would have one of these forms, and they would use that to collect the information. What is the assessment method? Portfolio, application details not applicable. What is the date and time of that assessment? So when do they intend to assess it? Attendees are not applicable. Whether a go-to meeting is required. And then attendees, mostly this will be the apprentice. But if anybody else is attending, if, for example, the apprentice might need support, you might need to gather the attendees there, extra detail about who they are and what their contact details are, so you can invite them to the meeting. And again, underlining any evidence to be uploaded. So that's where you would draw attention to the pieces of evidence that need to be uploaded, and also to put in a date of when they need to be uploaded. Now, the system will automatically calculate this, but I think it's important that's part of the discussion, because that will hopefully reduce the amount of issues that we get with customers not uploading their evidence in time. Okay, any questions, any thoughts at that point before we continue? Okay, just Caroline.
Hello, I do have a question.
Yes.
If you're going to see more than one apprentice during the scheduled meeting, is there any room on the form to add the second apprentice or third?
Yeah, and that's a good point, actually. I'm going to put you back on mute a minute, Caroline. That's a good point, and it's when I was looking through this last week, this is why I've said this is a sample. I think ideally what we should have on this form is, if there's more than one apprentice in the meeting, we should gather all of the apprentice information for each of the assessments on one form. The problem being is that for each apprentice, there is similar information, but there's also different information. So I think we will need to look at this form again and make it appropriate for where we have planning meetings that involve discussing more than one case. So, you know, we haven't got reams and reams of paperwork for the IEPA to complete. So we'll take an action to look at that. It's a good point, well raised, thank you. Any other questions or points? Okay, I've got another question. Bear with me a second. That's a good question. So one of our IEPAs just flagged, is there a GDPR issue with having an apprentice present while discussing other apprentices? And I think that's something that we need to ask the customer team to speak to the customers about. Fundamentally, that planning meeting is not about discussing apprentices' performance. It's not about anything about the apprentice. It's about trying to schedule some dates. So, you know, as I've said, the provider should come to that meeting having done the work around when the available dates are. So they have a number of different options when it comes to the different assessment methods for each apprentice. So there shouldn't really be any discussion that's specific to any kind of apprentice abilities or any of their information. It really is just an opportunity for the apprentice to listen into the conversation and to, you know, to understand the different assessment methods they're going through and to engage with those dates. So there shouldn't be a GDPR issue, but thank you for raising it, and I will flag it. Does that answer your question? If they are in different, that's a good point. If they're in different employers, I would envisage that the provider would probably choose not to have the apprentice present. So if the apprentices are in different providers and there is a planning meeting, then under those circumstances, the provider, you know, they have the option to ask the apprentice along if they see value in it. But if it becomes an issue where you've got some kind of conflict, or if you've got different employers, or it's too difficult to manage, even, you know, the planning meeting, scheduling dates is already a challenge between two stakeholders, a provider and an IEPA. It could be that the employer wants to come. That's another, you know, scheduling opportunity that we have to take into account. If you have a number of apprentices, that adds another possible scheduling headache onto it. So I envisage that the providers will manage with this in the best way possible for them. If they see real value to the apprentices, it could be that the apprentice does attend that meeting. But I think it will be up to the provider. And I think if there are different employers, they will choose to do it in a certain way. But thank you for flagging the point, and I will raise that to the customer-facing teams that are working with customers. Just bear with me a minute. Okay, all really good questions. Thank you very much. Anything else? Anybody else got any questions? Raising hands? No? Okay. At that point then, we're going to move on. Okay. No. Just the screen. Okay, now one of, and I'm sorry, I don't remember your name. One of the attendees asked a question about Evolve. Now, Evolve is not the responsibility of the IEPA to book. However, it is important that the date for the Evolve test is captured. The date that the provider intends to book the Evolve test is captured also in EPA Pro by the IEPA. So when the IEPA is scheduling the assessment components, one of the dates that they do ask the provider about is when the Evolve test is scheduled for. And when those assessment dates are set up in EPA Pro, they will be adding the date for the Evolve test. That's important because the IEPA, through the steps that they're taking, are creating placeholders for the assessment. And by putting the date of the Evolve test in the platform, they are creating a placeholder for the results. So when the result is sat in Evolve and the result is derived, internal teams in City and Guilds will take that result and they will put it into EPA Pro. So it's really important that even if it is the responsibility of the customer, the provider, to book that process, and that doesn't change. It's currently their responsibility. During that planning meeting, the Evolve assessment date is something that is discussed, or is something that is highlighted, so the IEPA can add that date to EPA Pro. And it's also important because under certain circumstances, you know, the Evolve test has to happen in a certain sequence. I think for business admin, it's advisable it happens first. So there'll be an internal team that will be checking our Evolve bookings to make sure that the customer doesn't go ahead and book that Evolve test before the planning meeting. If they do, they'll be asked to cancel it and wait until the planning meeting has taken place. But it's important that the Evolve test is referred to, and it's underlined that the Evolve test needs to be taken first. And the date of that Evolve test will also, if it has to happen first, will also drive the scheduling for the other assessment methods. So if it does have to happen first, you know that you can book, you know, the subsequent assessments after that agreed Evolve test taking place. But in terms of the booking, it's the responsibility of the customer to book that Evolve in the normal way, as they currently do. Any questions at that point? Elizabeth?
Hi, it's Liz again. With the Evolve test, you're saying that we're giving them the results for all the components. Will it be the IEPA's responsibility to release those results to confirm them?
In terms of the Evolve test, no. The results are released in the normal way that they currently are. They appear on Wall Garden, I think, if memory serves me. So it's not your responsibility to do that. That will happen. In terms of the other results, as soon as the assessment judgment has been quality assured and confirmed, and it's sent out, then the customer will be able to see those results on EPA Pro. And if there is rescheduling to do, you know, so for example, if in one of the standards, and you have to forgive me because I am aware of how it works with business admin, but there are lots of standards. So talking across the standards, if there is a particular standard that involves, you know, components happening in a certain sequence because they're interrelated or because the assessment plan says that, if the customer fails one, it could be that the assessment dates for the subsequent assessments also need to be rescheduled. So if there is a fail, the customer is informed, but it might be necessary for the IEPA to contact the customer to say, okay, there's a fail, we need to reschedule a reset and or subsequent dates. Depends on the assessment standard, but that is, you know, scheduling the assessment dates is the role of the IEPA and the providers together. So anything that impacts that could mean that certain things have to be rescheduled. So it's not another planning meeting, and not another official planning meeting needs to be set up, but there does need to be an email or a conversation between the provider and the IEPA about what impact that would then have on any dates that have already been scheduled for the assessments. Does that make sense, Liz?
Yes, within our standard, they don't have to sit the test beforehand, but they are advised to. So maybe it won't have such a big impact as on other standards.
Yeah, and I think that the biggest problem that we sometimes have is that people try to sit the Evolve test before they pass Gateway. And that is not permitted either. So that's why there's an internal team. So if they do try and book, because it's on demand, there's nothing that we can stop them from booking an Evolve test before they've gone through Gateway. It has to be monitored, and we'll be monitoring that internally. So that's the biggest risk, I think. But in terms of, you know, there not being a particular sequence, that does make this process a little simpler. And really, what we're talking about is if a candidate, you know, if an apprentice fails a component, then we won't necessarily have to reschedule the assessment methods, but we will have to reschedule a resit if they choose to resit it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure, thanks.
Great, thanks, Liz. Okay, any other questions from anybody? Right, just glancing down, make sure there are no hands up. No, okay. I'm going to go for another 10 minutes and then we'll have another break for 5 minutes. Hoping my voice is going to hold up for 3 days. Right, okay. We've already looked at this, and this is a duplicated slide. Okay, so I'll go back to that. So as I've already said to you, there are 2 key systems for assessment material, and this does slightly complicate things for the beta, but we are looking to monitor and review this as we work through beta in order to facilitate this process. But currently, EPA Pro is used for the majority of booking, registering, making assessment judgments for the customer to submit their own evidence. That's all done on EPA Pro. In terms of sharing, and also failed feedback is also done on EPA Pro. But in terms of sharing information about the assessment, so assessment documentation that isn't shared with the customer, and go-to-meeting recordings, in order to share that with our leapers to allow them to be able to quality assure the work of the IEPAs, we are having to use a system called SharePoint for beta. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means in terms of process in a moment, but I just wanted to highlight that again to you. Now, we're using 2 systems, and for beta, as I said, it does complicate things slightly. Ultimately, though, we are looking to have all of the assessment documentation, so all of the feedback, all of the assessment documentation in SharePoint, and a proportion of it will also be in EPA Pro. That's the parts that EPA Pro can support. Now, I'll talk through what that means in just a moment. Okay, this is quite a sort of complex process diagram, so let's start slowly. So I'm going to start with, and I'll explain this, have a chance to reflect on it, and then a chance for questions. So we'll start off with a component assessment. So we look at 1 assessment method. We'll start on this top corner here. So the evidence is provided by the provider and the apprentice through the EPA Pro platform. So the evidence is provided that. So in this specific example, because it's the one I'm most familiar with, let's talk about the portfolio assessment. So the portfolio evidence is provided 2 weeks before the assessment date that's scheduled. If there's any other assessment, it could be whether it's an interview, there might also be evidence that's provided by the provider. Just making some notes on this slide. Then the assessment takes place. So when I say the assessment takes place, this is where you as experts, as subject matter experts and trained IEPAs, would look at the evidence and make a judgment. Now, mostly that could happen, remotely. If you're looking at evidence that's been uploaded onto the platform, could be done face-to-face if you're visiting to observe. But I think in most cases with business admin, it's a remote assessment where you're doing an interview or there's a project presentation. So the assessment takes place there. Then through that assessment process, the IEPA will complete an amount of documentation. There's assessor forms, there may be a feedback form for fail, and they may have to enter results. And then what they're doing is going in 2 directions. So assessor documentation, everything is saved on SharePoint. So even the things that you're saving on EPA Pro, for beta, we are saving it also in SharePoint. That's important to underline because even if the system doesn't allow us to keep everything in the same place, we do recognise for audits, we do need everything in the same place. So once the assessor has completed their documentation, any failed feedback, everything is saved in SharePoint. In addition, the results and any fail feedback is also saved on EPA Pro. Because it's a beta, we'd like to test out this process on EPA Pro. And so we're asking our assessors to put the results and any subsequent fail feedback onto EPA Pro. But we'd like them to save everything or share everything on SharePoint. So SharePoint will be the place which will be our sort of single source of information. It'll be the bank of all information relevant to that assessment. Once they've done that and they've derived their results and entered it onto EPA Pro, if it requires quality assurance, it will go to the LEPA, and the LEPA will have access to that apprentice. They will have access to the work on EPA Pro. They will be able to see the judgment that the IEPA has given that apprentice, and they'll be able to see any subsequent feedback on that apprentice through EPA Pro. They'll also be able to access the information in SharePoint, so they can check where necessary the judgment that the IEPA has given to that evidence. So the LEPA will be able to access both of these things to quality assure the work of the IEPA. If any changes are required, then that's an offline conversation in the same way as it is today with the IEPA, and then the IEPA would need to go back in and amend the documentation in SharePoint and eventually amend any documentation in EPA Pro that's relevant. So there's a quality assurance loop there. If it's a pass, as soon as the LEPA signs off that result, it goes out to the provider. Now, currently, I think there are a number of steps that result has to go through before it gets to a provider. But with EPA Pro, this is much more immediate. So the LEPA shouldn't quality assure or release anything unless they're sure it needs to go out, because the result is pretty immediate, and that result will go to the provider and the apprentice. If it's a fail result, it will also go to the provider, and if it is a fail result, the fail feedback that has been prepared by the IEPA will also go to the provider, again from the platform. And that is an improvement as well, because currently any fail feedback has to be taken off the learning system and emailed out to providers. But instead, this will be provided directly through the platform. The fail result will go out, and then if it is a fail, there then may need to be a conversation between the IEPA. So the IEPA would contact the provider to reschedule an assessment date for a resit if necessary. That conversation will happen. And then the loop goes around again. So just points to remember that I wanted to draw your attention to. So the dates that you agree in that planning meeting, remember that they drive this process. So the dates that you agree in the planning meeting will give the provider the dates to upload that evidence. Equally, the dates that agree in the planning meeting and put into EPA Pro will also drive the dates for that assessment to take place. The results are released a component at a time. So this is one component, and this will happen for each of the components. And once it's quality assured, the result will go out to that provider, that single component. Final documentation will be in two, well, for some of the final documentation in two places. So SharePoint is going to be our single source of information. So everything will be in SharePoint. EPA Pro will contain the fail feedback and the results. If a retake is needed because they fail, it's for the IEPA and the provider to have that conversation about when they schedule that reset based on their availability. And again, because the results are released by components, the fail feedback will be pertinent only to that component. So I think currently the fail feedback is across all of the assessment methods, but if a candidate fails an assessment method, the fail feedback will be relevant to that, and the fail feedback will be released along with the results at a component or an assessment method level. Okay, there's quite a lot of information there, so I'm going to pause there and I'm going to give you the chance to ask any questions that you need to. Got a couple of hands up. Caroline. Caroline, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Sorry,
Yep.
maybe John. That woke me up.
Right. You've said there the provider will be reminded about when to upload the evidence.
Yes.
Will the EPA be informed that the evidence has been uploaded?
There is a notification. Let me check this because that's a good question. As far as I know, there's a notification on the system that evidence has been uploaded. But what we are, I'm going to put you back on mute a minute, Caroline. What we're hoping to do is, well, what we'd like to happen is that the IEPA would engage with the EPA Pro system. So they're managing their diary, that when they set those assessment dates, they have an idea that the evidence would be uploaded at a certain time. So they would go and refer to that. But as far as I know, there's also a notification that comes up on the system that evidence has been uploaded, but let me check that. I'm not 100% sure. Anything else, Caroline?
Thank you.
Okay. Anything else from anybody else? Any hands, any questions? Okay. All right. At that point, I think I'm going to pause again. I've been talking again for an hour. Just need a break for about 5 or 6 minutes. I'm going to come back at about at 20. I'm going to come back at 25 to 12, I think. So just give us about 67 minutes break. So thank you for your attention so far. Just going to pause for a bit to give you a chance to stretch your legs, and we'll come back for the final part of the processes in this session. Okay, hello everybody again. So we're back for the last hour of our marathon session. Okay, so let's go back a step, I think. We ended up here and we were speaking about the process of assessment and using the different systems to upload learner evidence. So from here, I just want to go through in detail the process from the perspective of the IEPA when it comes to carrying out the assessment. As I've already said, the EPA team, the EPA booking team, have a role in supporting the setup of GoToMeeting. That is in terms of setting up the event and also helping to download the recorded meetings that are conducted by the EPA and putting that recording into SharePoint. So that's something that the EPA team booking will continue to support with. And as I've already said, SharePoint is that place where we're putting all of the assessment information. So the EPA booking team will have a role in making sure that the recordings that you're making when you're carrying out your remote meetings and remote assessments, whether it is the interview or the project presentation, they will be uploading that information to SharePoint for the LEPAs. The IEPA will be able to view that information because it's part of the GoToMeeting link that they were already part of. So they'll be able to download that and look at that themselves. As is, that doesn't change from the current process as far as I know. Okay, so the assessor uses the information that's on the portal or uses the information that they've generated through assessor forms to produce a result. Now, the assessor forms, the forms that are part of the assessment process and fail feedback for a particular component are all saved by the IEPA onto SharePoint. So once they've completed their assessment and they're ready for the LEPA to quality assure it, all of those forms and that information is all saved on SharePoint. However, if the candidate has failed, the fail feedback form will also be added to EPA Pro. So in this circumstance, the fail feedback is in two places. It's on EPA Pro because the LEPA can access it there. And we'd like to test out that process through the beta. But it's also saved on SharePoint because, as I've said, we'd like all of the assessor information to be in one place through beta. Once they've uploaded something to SharePoint, the IEPA should ping their LEPA an email, but the LEPA will also receive an auto notification that new materials by their IEPAs have been uploaded. So they also get an automatic notification, but we think it's important that the IEPA would also just ping them an email to say they've completed the work on an apprentice and or a particular component, and the assessment information is available on SharePoint and EPA Pro. At that point, the LEPA will look at the information on EPA Pro, the results on EPA Pro, the fail feedback if necessary on EPA Pro, and all of the assessor documentation to support their quality assurance of that judgment on SharePoint. If it's all correct and the LEPA's happy with it, if it's being QA'd, that particular result is being QA'd, and we know that the LEPA's sample, that particular result is being QA'd, then the LEPA is happy, but they've looked at everything, and the LEPA will then release that result, and that result for a particular component will go out to the customer. And that's fine if the process ends there. If, however, once the LEPA QAs that, if there are amendments to be made, the LEPA will have an offline conversation with the IEPA about the amendments that need to be made. And then at that stage, the IEPA will need to amend the forms if necessary, their assessor judgment forms if necessary. It could be that they need to amend the results on EPA Pro, or it could be that they need to make some tweaks to the fail feedback. Now remember, that fail feedback is in 2 places. So this is a little bit more complicated through beta than we'd like, but currently that failed feedback is in 2 places. It's on SharePoint and it's also on EPA Pro. So if there are amendments to be made to that form, the IEPA will need to save a new version of it onto SharePoint, remove the old version from EPA Pro, and then add the final version. Once that's been done, the LEPA can then release the results and the feedback, and the result will go out to the provider. Okay, again, there's a lot of information there, so I'm going to pause to see if you have any specific questions or if you've got any hands up. Questions so far? Hoping that's a good sign. Scanning through the names, I think that's fine. Okay, so if you're happy, we will move on. Oh, I have one question. Is there a separate slide for grade calculation? That's from Megan. No, there isn't a separate slide for grade calculation, Megan, and we will need to clarify that. So I can talk you through that actually. Okay. Just Megan has just raised a point. Okay, so Louise's question is around whether the provider can see everything on EPA Pro at all times. Louise, they can't. Well, they can see it once it's been QA'd and released. So they can see the results once it's been quality assured and it's been released. And they can see the failed feedback once it's been QA'd and then being released. So if there is a piece of documentation up there that needs to be amended, that doesn't matter. Now we've gone back and forth with the best way of doing this. As I said, the limitation with EPA Pro currently is that we can't have information that we need to on the platform, because once the result is released, then any documentation is shared with the customer. That's why we're using SharePoint. We toyed with the idea of the IEPA putting it on only on SharePoint, and then once it's been confirmed, putting it on EPA Pro. But that would involve the IEPA having to email every IEPA to tell them it's been confirmed. So we felt that this was a simpler way of doing that process. Again, we need to see how this works through beta and to get some feedback from you. I am mindful that this last stage involves us removing something from EPA Pro and replacing it with final feedback. And also it's a case of saving that failed feedback in 2 locations, which is not ideal. Just going to go back to the questions. Give it a minute. Sorry. Okay, in terms of, I'm going to just go back through some of these things. In terms of the overall result, as you know, the overall result comes once the apprentice has completed all the different component results. And usually, in order to derive that overall result, the IEPA will complete a grade calculation form. And if that's not the case for the standards, then please flag it. But there's usually some kind of way that the IEPA will bring the grades together to derive an overall result. And that's a grade calculation. So they'll take the different results of the components, they'll combine them together, and that will produce an overall result. Again, what we are asking the IEPA to do, once they go through that process, so once the apprentice has done all the components, they have the results. When the IEPA brings those results together and completes that grading calculation, That form, again, will be saved in two places. It will be saved on SharePoint, and it will also be saved on EPA Pro. Now on EPA Pro, the EPA will be able to see that form, but actually the customer won't be able to see that form at that point. So again, when it comes to the overall grading calculation, that grading calculation form, the results will be entered onto EPA Pro. So the final result for the overall endpoint assessment will be entered onto EPA Pro by the IEPA, and then the grading calculation sheet will be entered into two places, on SharePoint and also on EPA Pro. Again, the LEPA will be able to access the result on EPA Pro, and they can access that grading sheet on either SharePoint or EPA Pro. Any amends to that documentation will be an offline conversation, and the IEPA will need to go through the same process. If amends need to be made, then the final documentation needs to be added to SharePoint and also to EPA Pro, and the old version of the document needs to be removed. Okay, again, I'm going to pause there. We've got a few questions, but are there any more questions at this point before we continue? Questions on the one that we've seen, so I'm going to just cancel those and hands up or any questions, so I'll carry on. Okay, we come to resets. We know that there are a small proportion of resets in any process. The results, as I've already said several times, but I think it's worth reiterating, the results for each assessment method or component are released once the LEPA has approved the outcome. Where necessary, they've actually quality assured the different elements, and where necessary, if it's a fail, they've quality assured the failed feedback for the component. Where an apprentice fails a component, the IEPA will contact the provider to reschedule a reset. We're also giving that ownership to the customer as well. So, once the results are released, then the customer will receive the results through EPA Pro quite quickly, and the message is for them they know that they need to reschedule a reset, and their point of contact for doing that is the IEPA. In certain standards, if the assessments have to be taken in a certain order, in certain standards, it is really important for the IEPA for them to understand when a reset is rescheduled, because it might mean that they need to shift the assessment dates of the other components. As Liz has said, that's less relevant for business admin. But in order to reschedule a reset, it's a conversation, another conversation or an email between an IEPA and a provider. That reset date is arranged based on mutually convenient dates between those two key parties. And then once that date is agreed, that date is added to the to EPA Pro, in the same way as the original dates were set in there. So there's a reset in there, and that date will be added. As I've already said, if the apprentice fails one of the first components for certain standards, it might mean that reset could involve rescheduling other assessments, but that doesn't appear to be the case with business admin. That makes this process a little easier. Where an apprentice failed an evolved test, obviously the IEPA doesn't have any visibility of that. So the provider is asked to contact the IEPA to confirm any reset plans they need to confirm if there is an evolved test reset, when that date will be. And again, with any of the assessment dates, that date is entered into EPA Pro to make sure that we've got an accurate picture of all of the assessment dates that have been scheduled. And that is again a sample email template for the IEPA to contact the customer to tell them about the results, although they will have already got results on EPA Pro, and to ask them to reschedule any dates for subsequent assessment again, that's a template. And we'll be looking at those templates as a resource pack before we go live. Any questions at that point? Just get a chance to digest that. We're doing quite well in terms of time, which is good news. Okay. Right. At any point, as you know, the customer might decide to withdraw or cancel an apprentice's EPA, and we are putting in place very clear guidelines around the charging points of that. So if customers are withdrawing or cancelling apprentices' EPAs last minute, they will be charged for that. It can be done at any point by the customer in EPA Pro, so they can select to withdraw a candidate. And the impact of that, it might be a number of things. If you've been allocated a case as an IEPA, you might find that suddenly all of the planning meetings or the dates that you've set for that apprentice for the assessment list are automatically cancelled. Or it could be the apprentice status will actually change, even if the assessment dates remain. So the EPA booking team are monitoring this, and they will inform the IEPA who's been allocated that apprentice about any cancellations or withdrawals. So you'll be aware as to why the status of an apprentice changes, or you'll also be aware not to attend any assessment sessions that have been planned until advised otherwise. It could very well be that that's a permanent cancellation. The EPA team inform you about this, and they ask you to cancel those dates in EPA Pro, so that you don't mistakenly attend an activity that you don't want to. If an apprentice doesn't turn up for an assessment, this is an important point. So it's a programmed assessment that has been programmed as part of the planning meeting. Then the IEPA should register the assessment as an absence on EPA Pro. If an apprentice doesn't, and they should also let the EPA Pro, the EPA booking team know about that. But we're trying to encourage the right behaviour in our customers. So it's really important that we enforce this. If we've booked a date, the date is in the diary, and the apprentice then doesn't turn up for a number of reasons, and there could very well be a valid reason for that. But it's important that the IEPA would register this as an absence in terms of the results on EPA Pro, and that will be then processed in a certain way. Any questions? Motoring along now. Okay, malpractice. We don't get many of these, but we just wanted to flag how we envisage the malpractice process will work going forwards. And again, this might need some revision through beta as we understand how it works and the frequency of these cases. Currently, malpractice tends to be identified and it is addressed before the overall result goes out. But as we are releasing results at a component level in the new world, if an IEPA identifies any malpractice, if there's plagiarism in the portfolio or a number of different things that classify as malpractice, as soon as that's identified, they need to flag that to the LEPA that they're allocated. Now, the LEPA will review that and will raise it directly with the INC team, the investigations and compliance team, and that's our internal team who have the responsibility for investigating those things. The INC team will contact the customer to explain that investigation, and any EPA events that have been planned will be suspended. So if, for example, there are a number of assessment dates that are already in the diary, this information will be given to the investigations and compliance team, and they may contact the IEPA to say that we need to cancel those dates because the assessments can't proceed until we have an outcome on the malpractice. Now, that will really depend on the standard, the nature of the malpractice, and how connected the assessments are. Some of the assessments might be okay to proceed because they're not connected in any way, but where malpractice occurs in a piece of material that relates to another assessment, that assessment may be put on hold. So the investigations and compliance team once they've been contacted by the LEPA, will give guidance to the IEPA about how to respond in terms of any scheduled assessment dates. And any EPA event results are held pending the outcome of their investigation. If there is no malpractice, the INC team will notify the IEPA, the LEPA, and the EPA team, and then the IEPA will be free to carry on with the assessments or to reschedule any assessments that they needed to cancel. Any questions? Okay. Make sure. Right, moving on. We're nearly there. So just wanted to underline some of the timescales for completing the activity. I think the key one to underline is the first one, because that is new, actually. So we're saying that as soon as you accept the allocation of the case, so as soon as the IEPA is allocated and accepts that case as their allocation, we would like the planning meeting to have taken place with the provider and the necessary other people within 10 days. So it's really important that once you've been allocated that case, you've accepted it, that initial email to propose planning meeting dates is sent off as quickly as possible, and those dates are within the next 2 weeks. That's really important to underline. I've got a question, I'm going to pause. It's 10 working days, just to clarify that. Thank you for that. I'll make a note of that and clarify it in the next presentation. Is there a timescale for setting the assessment dates after the planning meeting is the next question. There isn't, Liz, and we haven't put a timescale in place, and we will need to monitor that through the beta. My only advice is that obviously from the customer perspective and apprentice perspective, they would like to complete the assessment as soon as possible. As soon as the scheduling limitations of the IEPA and the provider will allow, and also if certain amounts of time need to be kept between the assessments, that will have a bearing. So we haven't put a kind of standard in place for when those assessment dates need to take place. What we would say is we'd encourage those assessment dates to be scheduled as soon as possible, with respect to the IEPA diary and the customer diary. And for the IEPA to be as flexible as you can, which we know you are, in that scheduling, because it is a challenge, and obviously that they would like to complete their endpoint assessment as soon as they can. Any other questions? Just check. Sylvia, hi.
Hi, I just want to clarify. I know you're looking at various different standards, but for our standard, once a date has been accepted by an IEPA, that date doesn't change even at the planning stage, because all the assessments are done on the same day.
Okay, and so for the case, that is a good piece of insight. In that case, then, Sylvia, excuse me, I'll leave you off here, so you can come back in and make sure I'm saying the right thing. But for business admin, if they're all done on the same, so are you saying that the portfolio is assessed on the same day that the project presentation and the interview is done, or the interview and the project presentation are done on the same day?
It's done on the same day, so it's not a portfolio that's assessed, it's the interview that's assessed. So on the day that the date has been agreed, before the planning meeting takes place, on that date agreed, the portfolio interview takes place, followed by the presentation and QA session. So once the IEPA has agreed that date, when it's been allocated to them by the EPA team, then that planning meeting is purely to confirm the time, the date that's already been set and agreed, and how soon they need those documents submitted.
That's the difference, Sylvia. So can I just point of clarity, that portfolio is not a component. You don't return a result for that component, that portfolio. The portfolio is the materials that you use to do the subsequent. Is that right?
We use the evidence in the portfolio to ascertain facts when we get the answers from the questions that are asked in the interview. So when you actually put that screen up to say there were 4 components, that's actually incorrect. There are only 3 components, and that's the online test, the portfolio interview, and the presentation.
Okay, that's fine. And I said I'll correct that afterwards, and we'll make sure that is clarified for each of the standards that we do try and go forward. So thank you for that.
I was just thinking that maybe some people confused by saying on that planning meeting you will decide the date.
Can I just stop you there? Because when you are given the allocation by the endpoint assessment team, they're not giving you a date for those things to take place. They're only giving you an apprentice or a number of apprentices at a provider. So that's when I say a case, that's what I mean. So they're no longer coming to you saying this is the date they want it. Now, when I said that the endpoint of the IEPA is responsible for owning that, that's what I mean. So they get the allocation, they know there's an apprentice, they know the location, they know roughly it needs to happen as soon as possible, they would accept or reject that allocation. Then what happens is there is a planning meeting. Now, from what you say for business admin, that's actually quite simple for because there are 3 components. There's the evolve test, there is the portfolio interview, and then the project presentation. Is that right? Is my terminology correct?
Yeah.
So, and those last 2 would happen on the same day. But during that planning meeting, what you're doing is you're saying to your provider, okay, so the evolve test, when do you plan to book that for? And the provider will say, oh, the 10th of February. And that will be a date that you will capture. You're not booking it for them, but you do need to capture that date. And then the next 2 things, so what day, and it will be the same day, can we do these next 2 assessments? And between your availability and the provider's availability, that's when you set the day for those 2 subsequent assessments. So that's set in the planning meeting by the IEPA and the providers together. So it's no longer given to you by the endpoint assessment booking team. Does that make sense?
It does, and I'm pleased we had that discussion actually, because that means that when the IEPA is offered a case, it's not necessarily based on their availability, because the availability will come once the planning meeting takes place.
Yeah, exactly. And I said, and that is very different. There'll be so Steve Howe's team, which is the EPA booking team, they're a growing team, and we are looking for them to build more insight as to availability of IEPAs. They will have information on the cases they've been allocated, the timescales, they'll have information on the dates, but it is for the IEPA to according to available space in their diary, to set a date with the provider, and it's a negotiation between those 2, rather than bringing this middleman into the equation and having to go through, this is a case, they want to do it this date, the IEPA can't do it that date, you go to the IEPA, they propose a different date, and so you've got this kind of back and forth. In the new world, that will be a direct conversation. So there'll be more, and I envisage there'll be a bit more flexibility for the customer and provider to find a date that's mutually convenient. Obviously, it could very well be that once they've had that discussion, there really isn't any other date that they can do alongside the apprentice, and it could very well be at that point the IEPA might need to send that allocation back to the UK team. But we'd hope that with insight, with a bit of conversation with the IEPA in advance of accepting the allocation, then that would be limited. Again, we need to monitor that during beta, because we don't know at this stage, how flexible the providers are willing to be, and it may depend on the IEPA what flexibility they've got in terms of scheduling. So your hands up again, but you're not on mute. So is there a subsequent question?
No, only that presumably that meeting document will be submitted to the portal so that the LEPers will actually be able to work out their allocation.
Okay, so in terms of the LEPA training, we're doing that a little bit later in the month. But in terms of the dates and the allocation, the LEPA will be able to see different apprentices on the system. There will be reports that they have access to, and the dates for the assessments will be on the system. So what we're looking to do at the minute is to try and package that information for the LEPA, because as a LEPA, you obviously need to know what's going on in your team to understand how you sample and how you support. So what we're currently doing is looking to see how we package that information in the best way, that you can see what allocations have been accepted and what work is in train for the IEPAs. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, now the penny has dropped, I have to say, I think this will be a very good customer-centred approach. And I think it will also help the IEPAs in planning their workload as well. So, yeah.
I hope so.
Thank you, Rachel.
I hope so. Thanks, Sylvia. I hope so. And that really is, I mean, intention is, and I do fully appreciate there are complexities initially. It will be a new system. Things aren't necessarily run as smoothly as we want them to be, a little bit later on in the project. But actually, taking out that booking team will hopefully make the scheduling process a little bit easier for everybody. Okay, I've got a number of questions now, so I'm just going to go through them. So 10 days of working days I've answered. There's no time scale for setting up the assessment days as soon as possible. I've got a very long question, so just give me a minute to read it. Okay, so I think what the question that Claire raises is that whether this additional activity will increase the amount of work and time of the IEPs in organising an endpoint assessment. I think, Claire, my answer to that is it's really difficult to tell. I think some things will be more time consuming, other things will be less time consuming. And one of the reasons that we're doing beta at a very small scale is to try and monitor that. So I think it's really difficult to tell until we see some of the customer behaviour. We see how easy it is for the IEPA to engage with the system. We see how the system evolves. I think there will be some initial pain. There always is when a new system comes out. But I think at this stage it's really difficult to tell what impact it will have. But that is something that we will monitor and track through beta. And as I said to you, in terms of your role and whether, as you start, if you can, to accept some allocations on EPA Pro and get a chance to work this process through, a key part of it for us and for me will be to understand, what your feedback is. What impact does this have? So we can get a real sense of that. So before we do any further rollout and look to do this wider scale, we'll get a real understanding of that and we can address that. Okay. So another question, sorry, Claire, I'm just going to put that down. Lots of big questions. How will the EPA be allocated now based on what if availability? It's a good question, and I think some of it will be insight about availability. And currently, you are asked to put your availability into. I think it's called an EPA availability. I'm not sure of the name of the system, but it's the hub. We would expect you to continue to do that because that provides the EPA booking team with some good insight. Some of it will be about the EPA booking team getting to know their IEPAs, what their commitments are in terms of days, etc. And some of it is based on, other information that is in the platform. It could be a conversation with you in advance of, so if the EPA booking team know that they've got 10 apprentices in South Cornwall happening over the next 3 months, there might be an offline conversation with the IEPA to say, this work is coming based on what you've got, the fact that you've got other commitments elsewhere because you are associates, is that possible? And then that insight will form the basis of that allocation. The idea being is that we would hope to maximise the success of allocations being accepted, because it's not in anybody's interest to have is to allocate something to an IEPA to get a sense of what's involved and then to say no to it, because otherwise this, for the customer and for the IEPA, that's not an ideal experience. EPAs will be allocated based on insight about availability and also location, and also current workload. And one of the things that the current system doesn't really give us is a clear idea of what apprentices, what cases, and the status of all of those things. That information is in the portal, and that will help that allocation decision. Okay, hopefully clear that answers your question. If it doesn't, do you want to raise your hand now? For you? I'm going to take that as a yes. Good. I've got one more question there. Second. Where's that question? Okay, if the customer doesn't know when they are booking involved test date on EPA Pro, I think, as far as Elizabeth, in terms of the communication to the customer, we would encourage the customer to understand the target times for that evolved test before they have that planning meeting. And it could very well be that when they go to book that meeting, that evolved test, they put a different test in there, a different test date in there. And we'll be having some teams internally monitoring if there are any differences between the test dates in Wall Garden and the test dates that have been sort of provisionally agreed in that planning meeting. That will be a sort of internal monitoring that we do. And ultimately, the most important thing about having that evolved test in EPA Pro is not necessarily that it's the exact date of when the test is taken, because even if a customer books an evolved test on Wall Garden for a certain date, they can actually take the test a number of days in advance of that date. What's important is by putting the test date in EPA Pro, you as the IEPA are creating a placeholder for the results to be added at a later date by City and Guilds. That's why that process is important. We will be encouraging the customers to have a date in mind and to share that date with the IEPA, and then the IEPA putting that date in EPA Pro will create a space for the results to then be added. So all the results are in EPA Pro. Hopefully that answers your question. If it doesn't, do you want to raise your hand now? Okay. Good. Then in terms of the other SLAs are on there, really they are the SLAs that currently exist as far as I understand. So the IEPA would carry out an assessment of components that would happen, the assessment event would happen, then they would have 3 days to complete the documentation, to upload the documentation, and for it to be a result to be completed onto EPA Pro. The LEPA would then quality assure that result, accessing the information, and again they have got 3 days to quality assured to take some action on that result, and if there is no quality assurance action to be taken, that is then to be released within 3 days. And that release then is quite immediate to the apprentice. As I said before, currently it then has to go through a number of steps, but on the new system it goes directly to the customer. Okay, any questions at that point? And really, we'll pick this up later this afternoon, but I just wanted to underline this to you. Through beta, there'll be a number of contact points. We need to update the first one, that will be the gateway team. We'll add the contact details into that following this presentation. But for any EPA allocations, and through gateway, that will go to the contact details that are provided. If there are any issues with EPA Pro, we have a super user, who's Libby, who will be coming to the session this afternoon and walking us through some of the activity. If there are any issues with the system, then the communications would go directly to that email address. If there are any questions about the EPA process, about the system, how to work the system, any customer issues, that would go to the EPA booking team, contact details are there. And then in any standard specific technical queries, in the way that they currently are. I just wanted to flag those contact points to you. Okay, I'm just going to give you, that concludes the morning session. We finished a little bit early. I wanted to finish a little bit early just in case there were any additional questions. So before we do sign off for lunch, do you want, anybody have any points, any observations or any questions they want to raise? Hand up. Hi, Tracy.
Hello. I had a couple of points. You showed us what you called the initial meeting recording form. Would that not be better to stick with the standardised approach in changing the name to the planning meeting recording form?
Absolutely, Tracy. Do you want to?
Thinking to stop confusion.
Yeah, I think, and as I said, I think all of these were once we finished the training, we wanted to run through the first sort of series of training, wanted to use the feedback then to update some of the templates. I think that's really good feedback, and anything that simplifies it for the people involved, we need to do. So let's make it to that.
My other point was when we're asking about the evolve date, could we not include that in that form to capture it all in one place?
Sorry, say that again, Tracy.
When we're asking about the evolve dates,
it would be on the same.
It will be on that form as well.
It will be on that form as well. I separated the evolve slides out only because I wanted to underline it's not something that the EPA would normally do in the current world, so I just wanted to underline that. I need to make that clearer. I think what we'll do is we'll have a sample, but the evolve test will also be captured there. I think that planning meeting template needs to be, there are a few more things we need to do on that based on some of the feedback today and some of the observations I've made when I've tried to use it actually. So, but no, that's helpful. Thanks, Tracy.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Linda, so the IEPA's SLA agreement is often hindered waiting for the EPA team to upload the recording. Sometimes it takes up to 24 hours. Could the IEPA have responsibility for doing this? It's a really, really good question, and I'm so pleased that you asked it.